It's the Yukon Poly Podcast. Welcome. I'm Stephen Dyson. I'm here with Professor Jeff Dudas from Yukon's Master's Program in Politics and Popular Culture. And we talk about politics and popular culture on this podcast. And today we're going to talk about a little movie called Star Wars.
Star Wars.
An adventure unlike anything on your planet. Star Wars.
Here they come.
Yeah, which is really a hidden gem. I mean, more people should know about this movie, I think. I found it on the Netflix, and there it was.
It's a deep cut. Yeah.
Exactly. So we both rewatched Star Wars kind of in the last couple of days. We're going to talk about the politics of Star Wars, what I think are actually the weird politics of Star Wars, in three ways or on three levels. We're going to talk about some surface level comparisons between the politics in Star Wars and the politics in our world. I think we're going to delve into some of the mythical structures that are present in Star Wars, and then we're going to go ultra deep and think about whether Star Wars is a critical text, whether it does critical work in problematizing our world and perhaps even pointing the way to a future, hopefully better world. But before we get into that, Jeff, I thought we should speak a little bit about how we come to Star Wars. Personal history. So Star Wars came out the year before I was born.
I was 2.
You were 2 years old?
I was 2 years old.
Okay. But it suffused my childhood. I mean, it was just ubiquitous.
Yeah.
Was that the same for you?
Yeah, because there was nothing else like it. And, because I'm a little bit older than you, I vividly remember seeing both The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi in the theater on first run. And these were major events. And, this, you got to remember, I think the Return of the Jedi comes out even before VCRs are out. So, if you're seeing a movie, it's either on TV in syndication and rerun, or it's in the theater. So you just didn't have these kinds of mega events very often. And I can vividly remember my father actually bringing home one day after work the physical tickets to go see Return of the Jedi.
So my history is I was really more into Star Trek than Star Wars, and that was a big divide. I don't know if it still is anymore, because of course J.J. Abrams just crashed the two together as if there were no differences between them at all. But I was more into Star Trek than Star Wars. I was for a while, to be perfectly frank with you, quite hostile to Star Wars and quite sort of uninterested by it. I think as I've gotten older, I've become more interested in it. And rewatching it this time, I'm really struck by just an appreciation for some of the cinematic elements of A New Hope, of the film we're discussing today. I think there's two shots in particular that I wanted to kind of flag up just in this introductory kind of moment of appreciation for the text before we start kind of ripping it apart, as is our training as professors, as we're inclined to do. The first shot that I wanted to point out, something that really struck me on this reviewing, was I think the very first shot of the movie, where Lucas shows the kind of 3 planets, and it's a quotation of Kubrick's 2001, the first shot of which is 3 planets directly in a row, and this one kind of has 2 planets and then one off to the side, and then the little kind of Princess Leia ship comes, and then the giant Star Destroyer comes in, and that shows to me Lucas being cine-literate and understanding that he's working in a genre that is by this point defined by 2001, but it also is a very visual and immediate way of him showing that he is telling a different story than 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's a story, I mean, it's obviously in the title of Star Wars. Right. The second shot that I wanted to say, which I think is just pure cinema, and for all we're going to, I think, critique this movie, and we have some problems with it as a cinematic text and problems with it, with thinking it does very interesting things politically, I think the whole thing is completely redeemed for me by one single shot, which is Luke kind of walking off the edge of his family farm and looking up into the sky and looking at the 2 suns, and his kind of theme swells, and that is just pure science fiction cinema. Because you have him looking off into a distant future, imagining changing his circumstances. It's just a brilliant, evocative shot. I've always loved it, and watching it this time I had a real appreciation for that moment.
Those are two, I agree, those are the 2 powerful moments, certainly in the first act of the movie, and they really illustrate how it seems to me that most of Lucas's references here are interfilmic, or at least they are linked to previous forays into popular storytelling, right? But just in that comparison that you've noted, just in that reference to Kubrick's 2001, and in contrast to the opening scene of 2001, we get a pretty strong sense of how Star Wars at once exists filmically, referentially in the Kubrick universe, but also nowhere near it thematically. Right, because as you know, right, and as viewers maybe who have seen 2001 know, the first scene, most of the first act actually in 2001 is not science fiction. It is, primordial, right? So this is a big story. Kubrick's story is a big one that is self-consciously about the nature of humanity. On the other hand, right, what's happening in Lucas's first shot, it's cold steel racing against one another with humanity maybe in the backdrop at best.
Yes, yeah. Now, you think the first act of 2001 is about apes discovering tools and being guided by the monoliths.
Yes.
I know that they are proto-Wookiees. So really, it exists in the same cinematic universe.
Fair enough.
And we look forward to the J.J. Abrams movie that fills that in.
Blindingly clear.
Yes, with extreme volume.
Yes.
And excellent, so good. Why don't we get into the politics?
Okay.
Lucas himself has made some comments about the political analogies that he was drawn. There's a great literature on these things. Let me start by asking you, Professor Dudas, is the Empire in A New Hope the United States?
I don't think it is. I know that Lucas references that at some point. I don't see the Empire as the United States. I know the analogy is, right, this is a time we've just exited the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is one in a long series of proxy/hot wars that the United States fights over the course of the 20th century in developing areas, developing countries, not simply Southeast Asia, but of course really throughout Latin America and South America. And so the idea here is that the rebellion are freedom fighters, analogized presumably to the Vietnamese, and the United States is this kind of, empire, megalith that seeks to destroy anything in its path. To me, that's not persuasive. Darth Vader is not persuasive as an American empire figure. Darth Vader is a classic cinematic villain in the American tradition who is very clearly, it seems to me, analogized to a bad guy, the cowboy who wears black, right? This just feels like something he just grabbed onto that was circulating, and I don't see any thematic or obvious script-based intentionality that would suggest that the Empire is supposed to be understood as a late era capitalist United States.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see it?
I mean, Lucas did say I think when he started writing Star Wars in the sort of early 1970s, that he was influenced not only by Vietnam, but by his own personal opposition to the Nixon regime.
Yeah.
He analogized, I think, the Emperor, who doesn't appear, he's only alluded to in A New Hope, he analogized the Emperor to Richard Nixon. And I think the exact quote was, the Empire is the United States in 10 years' time, after President has been overthrown in a rigged election and a bunch of gangsters have taken over. I think it is true that the archetype of a Darth Vader figure circulates extremely widely in not only political culture, but and it doesn't need to be as specific as the United States and Nixon. Yeah.
Darth Vader is a kind of the leadership structure of the Empire is deeply ambivalent.
Yes.
We don't really know who's in charge.
Right.
I mean, later on, we'll learn that the Emperor is in charge and is pulling the strings and has been pulling the strings for some time, and that Darth Vader is mostly a kind of almost a mercenary sort of figure for the Emperor.
Right.
But in Star Wars itself, in A New Hope, we don't really understand who's in charge.
Right.
We don't know if it's Darth Vader who's calling the shots, or is it sort of military leadership? And that is problematic for some sort of, to me, is problematic for then trying to analogize Darth Vader or the Emperor to Richard Nixon.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because it seems to me to be a misfit for the contemporary critique that Lucas is claiming.
Right. It is a very interesting point in making political analogies between the world in A New Hope and our politics. That the politics are so loosely drawn in A New Hope, and as you say, the structures of the sort of chains of command on both sides, on the rebellion side as well, are not clear. I mean, Mon Mothma is supposed to be the leader of the rebellion, and she's on screen for like 30 seconds, is she? I mean, it's just not, Leia is a princess, but how does a princess fit into what a paramilitary organization of the rebellion? She's simultaneously a member of the Imperial Senate, which is, and I think when we talked about this in the last couple of days, you talked about how interesting it is that this is a period of civil war, and that there's a whole existing political structure that is being subverted or contested, and you're never actually given the sort of details as to how this works within the text of the movie. Obviously, things are filled in later or in the extra filmic universe that they're filled in, but this was one of the things when I said Star Wars frustrated me at certain points. That was one of the things that I did find frustrating, was that it was hard to get a grasp on who was in charge of what or doing what. Right.
It illuminates, I think, our broader issues with seeing Star Wars as an analogous political text that it's meant to comment on, that's meant to be a commentary on contemporaneous political moments or social events. Right. For example, the idea that the Empire is supposed to stand for Nazism or some other sort of totalitarian regime is also a little odd and poorly fleshed out. On one hand, we have stormtroopers, right, and a very clear and obvious reference to Nazi military officers. But on the other hand, we have this weird figure that you had mentioned yesterday when we were talking of Darth Vader, who is simultaneously a kind of a mystical, weird figure who draws on some sort of quasi-religious power, the Force, but also a kind of a battlefield tactician. And
a fighter pilot.
As well as a fighter pilot. Apparently not that good, though, because he's consistent.
He's very good at he turns a knob, doesn't he, on the top of he's very good at that knob turning element of the dogfighting craft. Which I didn't see in Top Gun Maverick recently, although everything else in Top Gun Maverick was like a shot-for-shot remake of A New Hope.
I've not bothered with the new Top Gun. I saw Top Gun once.
A lot of trench run action going on.
Yeah, I saw Top Gun
in Maverick
back when I was must have been a teenager when it first came out. The best part about Top Gun, I think, is clearly Danger Zone.
Yes.
By Kenny Loggins.
Is reprised.
But Darth Vader's, I don't know that he would do great in the Top Gun world.
No, or in any military world at all. And it's, the point you're developing there about the odd structure of the Empire and what is the Empire, and does it work if you make it a totalitarian organization? You say, okay, the Empire is not the United States, but it's one of the great totalitarianisms of the 20th century. I suppose this is the Cold War era. The Soviet Union is out there as the obvious political reference. It's also true that Lucas was very influenced by, maybe not World War II, but World War II movies, and sort of rather famously in trying to storyboard the trench run and the kind of dogfighting scenes, had taken clips from a bunch of World War II movies and Spitfires and German fighters and kind of spliced them all together. That side of things, Vader as existing in a military organization that fetishizes the aesthetic of the military, which is definitely in Star Wars, and being a sort of bizarro, weirdo, cultist figure. Maybe fascism is the right analog.
Maybe. On the other hand, you know who else fetishizes military uniforms and rank? The Rebellion.
Yes.
Right, which I had just noticed on the rewatch. Right. That in that first scene where Princess Leia is being, when she's getting the battle plans into the droids and being captured, the people who are protecting her are all in clear military regalia and garb.
Yes.
This is not a ragtag group of rebels,
Right.
who have various blasters hanging from off of their hips.
Yes.
Like these are military officers themselves, which again just sort of points to the ambivalence, right, or that suggests that these bright lines that Lucas is trying to draw between the Empire and the Rebellion are not quite as bright.
Yeah.
And I suspect it has to do with a kind of a limited imagination. Right, and a limited engagement and interest
Yes.
in kind of human matters.
Yes, or conversely, an unlimited and entirely indisciplined imagination,
Yeah.
a sort of magpie sensibility of, if you, let me put it this way, if you ask someone who has not spent a lot of time thinking about politics and certainly hasn't studied political science, which there are people, I know this is going to come as a huge shock, but there are people who are not that interested in political science or politics per se, but if you said, list me the things you know about the 20th century, or about World War II,
Yeah.
and they'd come up with fascism, communism, the Vietnam War,
Yeah.
I don't know, list me the things you know about Japanese, the samurai. They would come up with the things that Lucas comes up with because he is grabbing analogies from not a disciplined study of history and politics, but just from things you would know from being a human being.
Well, from film,
Yes.
right? And so here the analogy,
the analogy is
that I'm thinking
is
of
Ronald Reagan.
Is Ronald Reagan, exactly,
Yes.
right? So, most of what Ronald Reagan knew about American history came from filmed versions
Yes.
of historical moments. So it's, fictionalized, historicized, storyboarded versions of American history. And that may well be the obvious connection here between Lucas and Reagan. Lucas they don't share political projects to the extent that they're articulating visions of how to live. What they do share is a common store of historical reference filtered through film, filtered through human imagination, and with the ambivalent edges sawed off, a very kind of stark vision of good and evil, of heroism and villainy, and this is what makes them contemporaneous figures, right? Is the degree to which their political imaginations are tunneled through a very specific medium.
Okay, and we're back to talk about the second of our topics, the second of our incisions into the Star Wars text. We want to go now to the level of myth.
Yeah.
The mythical structures that exist in Star Wars. It's a work suffused with these mythical structures, I would say, many of which Lucas claims to have been present at the creation. There is some debate about how much they were present in Lucas's mind when he was writing it, as opposed to again retconned on afterwards. I mean, I wonder actually, in fact, would you like to start with that question?
Yeah. So again, my sense, similar to the question of is this a text that comments articulately on the politics of the day, and I think we said no, not really, right, in spite of Lucas's best efforts to retroactively claim it. My sense is that the mythical structure of Star Wars, the elements, the thematic elements that stretch back time out of mind into human history, are mostly operating at the level of the subconscious. And that makes sense to me because that's typically how these things work, right? It's typically not the case that we wander around and engage with one another with questions of culture and historical myth and storytelling top of mind. Myths reflect the ways that human beings have constructed the nature of living together, and they become familiar in a way that just seems to make sense.
A couple of years ago, I watched this movie, A New Hope, with my wife, who had bizarrely never seen Star Wars and only had the vaguest cultural awareness. And she comes out of it, and I said, "What do you think?" And she says, "Well, there's something in there for everyone, right? There's princesses, there's big furry walking, what look like toys for like little kids. There's fighting, there's aerial combat. There's something for every taste, because they're largely drawn from myths that are so available in the general culture. It's impossible to go into Star Wars and not feel even nostalgia, which is a bizarre thing to say for something that's supposed to be science fiction. We can come to this. Is it science fiction? But it's supposed to be inherently alienating and in another place, and it instantly feels like this kind of warm blanket. And I think it's because of Lucas's drawing liberally from mythical structures, good and evil, goodies and baddies, princesses who need to be rescued. I mean, all of these kind of structures just so suffuse the thing. Lucas says this is a filmic version of the monomyth, which is Joseph Campbell's identification, he would say, of a persistent story in all cultures. Of the hero's journey, of a hero who kind of leaves home and goes off and does amazing deeds, and there are certain beats, into the belly of the beast and all the rest of it. Lucas says that's what he's doing in Star Wars. Is he?
Yes, that's what's happening. Right. Now, again, the question of intention, it seems to me, is both important but also eventually beside the point. And what I mean by that is it's a reasonable question to try to focus on the intention of the author, right? Authorial intention, in this case, Lucas. Because frequently that kind of interrogation can be revealing and illuminating. But what really matters, it seems to me, in storytelling is the way that the audience connects to the story or doesn't, and what meaning the audience makes out of the story. And so in that way, it's kind of beside the point whether Lucas intends this to be a kind of, a resuscitation of the hero's journey, right? Which Campbell dates back to the Odyssey, right? But we see it in lots of places. For sure, though, I think that is one compelling way to read what's happening. The adventure, the journey of Luke Skywalker is the hero's adventure, right? And it contains elements, right, beginning with a misfit character who is alienated from their circumstances, alienated from their space in one way or another.
And he lets you know he's alienated.
Oh, yes. This is...
I was going to the same thing in the water.
It's that kind of, the infamously whiny Mark Hamill delivery. But yeah, this is a kind of teenage alienation is what this is, right? So he's out of place in that way. He's out of place, contemporaneously, because all of his friends have left Tatooine and they've all gone off to the academy. But he's out of place in a deeper sense, right? There is a sense of unrest, of misfittedness that he has, right? His parents, he's an orphan. There's a sense of lack, right? And this is the kind of the classic hero. This is not somebody who is accustomed to being mature in the way that Campbell argues is the sine qua non of maturity, which is the ability to set aside your own personal wants and needs for the sake of others, right? For Campbell, that fundamental moment of maturation is the act of parenting, right? That when one parents, one literally puts aside their own wants and needs for the sake of someone else, right? And has to do so in a consistent way. This is the hinge, Campbell argues, by which immature people become mature. And so for him, this is what accounts for the popularity and the lasting resonance of the hero's adventure. This is what makes it universal, is that it is a kind of a universal commentary on how you become mature, how you become adult. That's clearly all there, it seems to me, right? And I think it's there in Star Wars. It's definitely there if you take the trilogy, the sweep of the trilogy. But does it matter, do you think, if Lucas intends it to be there or not?
I think it mattered to Lucas, who I think was delighted to have Joseph Campbell adopt Star Wars as this intellectualized, this filmic representation of his text, because it intellectualizes Lucas's text. I know we've both read the How Star Wars Conquered the Universe, the excellent Chris Taylor book that we've got down here. I think if you read what was in Lucas's mind when he was coming up with the Star Wars idea, he wanted to make a hit movie that was like a revival of the Flash Gordon serial, and he wanted it to be for children. Mm-hmm. And so he was, I think, initially pointing in a different direction. Mm-hmm. Did he then come across a way to do both things, to make a movie that was for children but also had this kind of intellectual heft? Yeah. Perhaps, and there is some historiography on the specific timing of Lucas and Joseph Campbell's kind of interaction with each other. As one becomes mature in the hero's journey, does one also become political?
That's a good question. I think it depends, right? It depends on how we imagine what politics is about, right?
Blowing stuff up seems to be the...
Well, yes, it could, right?
Yes.
I mean, but to the extent that politics is imagined and configured in that sort of ancient sense of the art of living together, all of the things that a community of people do to contribute to the way that they live together, right? Which includes, elements of leadership and inclusion, but also exclusion and the exercise of power and authority and all of those things, then yes, it is possible, right, to imagine the process of maturation is also the process by which one becomes capable of participating in a polis, participating responsibly in a public, right? Making decisions that bind others to a common vision of good living together. But I also think there's some clear American specific thematic and mythic elements that point to Lucas's obsession with Westerns. The good versus evil, right? Literally the black-hatted enemy or villain, and Luke is wearing, he's constantly wearing white, right? So this is sort of shorthand reference for the good guy in American cinema.
It's one of the most subtle cinematic representations of good. You wear all black,
yeah.
you being white,
Yes.
try and figure out who's the...
And our audience will know, right? But then there's just the idea of the damsel in distress, right? In the American tradition is contained typically within a sort of a captivity narrative, whereby some sort of innocent, frequently virginal character is kidnapped or taken captive by a representative of pure evil, and that the kind of the dramatic action is the male rescue of the damsel in distress. Right? This notion of captivity narrative goes back in American literature to the late 17th century, and it goes back to one of the original, maybe the first mass popular or public storytelling element in American literature, which is Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative, which was printed and circulated and passed around reading publics in the late 1670s, and it's an account of this woman who was taken captive during the Pequot War, right? And it's kind of her story of what it was like to be captive and her representation of it. And we definitely get elements of that. I mean, for sure, right? Princess Leia is taken captive. We get elements of what her captivity is like. I don't think the film doesn't really dwell too much on that.
It alludes to it, but in ways that can be terrifying if you. And again, this is a very Lucas thing. This is the genius of the movie is to allude to something, but not to fully spell it out, which happens again and again, like the Clone Wars, Luke's father, the Emperor, all sorts of things. And this time, the terrifying illusion is a visual one. It's the flying kind of droid that has the whatever it's called, the injection, the needle.
Yeah.
The needle as the arm that's going to do some sort of hideous things to Leia.
Right. And we will see later, right, in The Empire Strikes Back, that torture is certainly a part of being a captive of the Empire when we see Han Solo tortured on Cloud City.
Yeah, Han Solo, a classic sort of cowboy frontier figure in the salon shooting people and all the rest of it.
With all of the kind of moral ambivalence that comes along with that. This kind of transitional character that is frequently used to point the way towards a more enlightened sort of political landscape.
Yeah, and as you were alluding to the sort of woman in captivity myth, this is an interesting waypoint in the filmic representation of gender relations. Yeah. Lucas believed he had produced a feminist film with Star Wars because he was criticized for the male focus of
American Graffiti.
That's the chap, which sort of lingered on the male characters and ignored the female characters. He'd originally had Leia as a pure damsel in distress. Then he went through a revision, largely under the kind of scrutiny of the frame that he was putting on gender relations. At one point, Luke was going to be a female character, and then he settled on Leia being the central female character, but her not only being a damsel in distress, her being a military commander and having some more agency.
And she is not helpless, right? Yeah. I mean, we see this when we're first introduced to her. She's shooting away
Right.
I mean,
Right.
she seems very comfortable with the blaster.
Right.
And she's at no point do you get the sense that she's an especially vulnerable character.
Yes. Although you still do get the clunkers, like Han says, well, if we have no more female advice, we might get out of this. And this, what counts as like, back and forth in the
But what
films
she's
at the
not
time.
doing, right? There's not the kind of in the Scooby-Doo world. There's the danger-prone Daphne.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That. She ends up being inadvertently responsible, not only for her own circumstances, but also kind of inadvertently putting the male characters in danger.
Yes.
That's not what's going on here with Leia, right? She is clearly a powerful figure, which is why she's taken hostage in the first place and not just murdered, right? She's working a series of plans. She's literally working both sides of the street, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
As an imperial senator, but also as some sort of military leader, right, in the rebellion.
And a traitor.
A traitor, indeed.
Bane was in. It was in A New Hope. In the cut I saw, anyway.
That was exactly like Darth Vader. I mean, it was
Yes,
spot on.
exactly.
Spot on. So she is an unusual, I think, damsel in distress. But yet, you're right. You still end up hitting the same kinds of story beats, right? Which is that she still needs to be saved. She's still represented as this relatively unspoiled young woman, right?
And an object of desire for the male characters.
For all of the male characters.
Yeah, right. Okay, so this is the break.
This is it.
So, I think what we should talk about is the UConn program in politics and popular culture.
If you have been intrigued or interested in any of the kinds of approaches that Professor Dyson and I have offered here, this is the sort of stuff that you would be looking to get into in the UConn master's degree in politics and popular culture.
Politics and popular culture.
Polypop.
in the Polypop. If you do an MA in Polypop, a Mapolypop, if you were to do a Mapolypop,
Yes.
then you would encounter this sort of material. I teach a class on political science fiction. Professor Dudas teaches a class on heroes and villains in American...
Typically in American culture, but could be expanded.
Classes on film and politics, politics and music.
Yeah.
It's an excellent program.
Yes.
Where can people go to find out about this tremendous opportunity?
Go to the UConn Political Science webpage, and there's a link
You could navigate to it.
to it. The URL for Polypop is
Going to appear on the screen
up there.
in the video
Down there,
description.
up there and down there.
Possibly both.
Yeah.
Perhaps simultaneously.
Yeah.
And we're back for our third section in our, a dissection, an appreciation, all of the above.
An illumination.
An illumination of Star Wars A New Hope. We're going to talk about whether Star Wars is doing critical work. What do we mean by that? We mean, is Star Wars providing a critique of the present? Is it making unfamiliar and problematic things that are perhaps taken for granted in our world? And is it pointing the way to a better future, to a different way of living, and hopefully giving some tips on how to get there? I think this is an important thing to talk about, because if we are to take Star Wars as science fiction, maybe we don't have to, but if we are, we should perhaps demand of it that it does some critical work, that it alienates us from the present in productive ways, that it makes some things of our current reality problematic, throws them into flux, and hopefully allows us to build a better future. I think scholars of science fiction would want science fiction to do that, and would regard it as, at best, a missed opportunity, and at worst, a sort of very pro-status quo, backward-looking thing, if science fiction was not taking that chance, because it is inherent to the genre. People would argue that possibility is there. There's a huge debate in science fiction studies about Star Wars, the franchise as a whole, and particularly this movie. And I would say there's great suspicion that Star Wars is doing this critical work.
So I think the text is a little bit of a head fake, it seems to me, on this question of science fiction, because after all, we're told in the opening crawl that this is a story that takes place in a galaxy far away a long time ago. So in principle, as the audience, we should be primed for a backward-looking tale. The problem, it seems to me, is that almost everything we see on screen is high-tech, right? I mean, light swords, right? Blasters, hyperdrive spaceships, the ability to hop from galaxy to galaxy. in the blink of an eye, as it were. This all points and primes the audience to science fiction-y stuff, right? This is futuristic because we can't do any of this stuff, right?
Right.
But at the same, so I mean, in a certain way, Lucas is trying to have it both ways. It seems to me, right? Once he's trying to make sure that the audience is entrenched in these nostalgic moments, or at least in this sense that this is something that happened somewhere else and it happened a long time ago, and so you don't need to worry about anything that's going to happen here causing any anxiety in you, right? Which maybe piggybacks on our first topic about whether this is a meaningful commentary on contemporary moments.
Right.
But on the other hand, he's loaded up this text with all kinds of futuristic stuff, which makes it seem like it maybe is intended to be science fiction.
Right, and the point of the futuristic stuff, if it's going to do critical work, is not to look nice and to be interesting, although they're obviously good things. It's that if the futuristic stuff is a logical extrapolation from human natural science and human agency and the human mastery and domination of its environment, if it's something that in principle we could imagine being achieved, that is an empowering text for human beings. Yeah. And it's saying not only that you can build a hyperdrive or a lightsaber, but that you will have phenomenal capabilities that should be able to lift you and your politics and your society out of want and out of poverty. Yeah. And your goal and your sort of obligation, your imperative, is to make your politics as good as your technology, to use your technology for good, but to make your politics kind of equally forward-looking and equally sort of non-repressive and non-alienating. And that's the great critical promise of science fiction. Yeah. Things don't need to be as they are now in the technological realm, but really what much more importantly than changing the technology is changing the human interactions.
Yeah, and on that score, there is nothing, as far as I can tell, in Star Wars, and maybe in the entire universe of Star Wars, that offers some kind of meaningful vision of alternative ways of living. What do we know about the cause of the rebellion? I mean, they're fighting for some disembodied sense of freedom.
Yes.
But what does that mean? We have, the idea of freedom is not an uncontested concept, right? It is itself a text, right? The concept of freedom is itself a text that is read in lots of different ways by lots of different cultures over the course of human history, to the extent that it even has been an important element in human history. But we don't have any idea what that means. It doesn't seem to map onto a substantive vision of good living. And so all we know about the rebellion is that they're just fighting the Empire for some disembodied value called freedom. Right? So if the idea with good science fiction is to offer an alternative vision to living, I don't think we're getting much, really anything like that out of Star Wars.
And the
do you?
I think you have to work hard and harder than you would want to in a truly progressive critical text to find that vision. I mean, I wonder if you would say, are there any elements of utopia in Star Wars? I mean, that I think is the crucial question. It doesn't have to be a fully specified utopia, but some sort of prefigurations. No, in the sense that in this movie, not only is there no articulation of what freedom would look like beyond vague illusions, and Han Solo's free to what? Smuggle? Am I free if I live in Leia's monarchy?
Yeah.
Is Luke free if he gets to go off and fly fighter jets? Yeah. I mean, what is that? That's a hero's journey, but is that contributing to a greater society? Yeah. So there's that. You've got the inherent problem, the anti-utopianism of the constant cycles through the franchise of, well, the Empire wins, and then the Rebellion wins, and then it's the First Order, and then it's really cyclical and going nowhere, rather than teleological and going somewhere. Yes. What would be the best case for a utopian vision? I suppose you would say that the Empire is as I read them, a sort of mono-species, technological, conformist, inherently repressive political and cultural structure. Yeah. The Rebellion is extremely diverse in species terms. There's they treat droids equally, even though the droids are kind of kicked out of the bar. We don't serve your kind here.
Yeah.
You know, they value droids, they value difference. So there's a sort of pan-speciesism that could be tied to notions of non-alienation on the basis of kind of race and religion and all the rest of it. I suppose that's the best case you could make.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems about as persuasive as any. I mean, it strikes me, though, that, I mean, this is the moment, right? So Lucas is famously, one of his filmic inspirations is Kurosawa's oeuvre. And this strikes me as the kind of, I mean, and I think mostly this is just a superficial kind of drawing of you know, kind of typical imagery from Kurosawa of, you know, samurais and kind of this late feudal era kind of interrelations. But the one thing, this is maybe the point at which, if there's any substantive link to Kurosawa's vision, is this notion of the cyclical nature of history, right? And the cyclical nature of political engagement. Because this is famously one of Kurosawa's major themes. In Kurosawa's, in his version of Macbeth, which is called Throne of Blood, right? There's this very famous scene in which you've got the presentation of time as a circular kind of process, right? And the way he has it, right? The story of Macbeth is just a kind of an age-old story of lust, power lust, and all of the terrible things that happen when humans get literally corrupted, right, by the notion of unlimited authority, right? To the extent that there's any kind of vision of the future in Star Wars, it seems that it's just that. It's circular, right? Well, first we've talked about this before. First the Empire wins, and then the Rebellion wins, and then there's a Republic, and then it falls, and the Empire comes back. It's so much so that Abrams had nothing else, you know, in the latest trilogy. It's just the same thing over and over again.
Yes, right? But that's not good. That's not going anywhere.
No,
right? That
exactly.
is telling you humanity.
Vision.
I mean, that is an anti-utopian vision. That is, you know, at whatever stage in history we are doomed to, you know, to just going. Repeat it and not go anywhere. I mean, the other thing that's going on here that we've alluded to is that there's a huge question about whether this is really science fiction and whether it should be held to the critical standards of science fiction. There is a tremendous debate in science fiction studies about whether that category should be broadened to speculative fiction and whether it should include works of fantasy. Yeah. And one of the more incendiary elements of this debate is the attempt that some science fiction scholars will stick to exclude fantasy. And the reasons for excluding fantasy are that it contains none of the human agentic elements that make science fiction perhaps a uniquely critical genre. This is Carl Friedman's central point, that science fiction and critical theory are essentially a version of each other and are uniquely well matched to do the same job. And fantasy is often lumped in together, but is phenomenally ill matched, is not at all even a generic cousin. And why not? It's because what do you get in fantasy? You get the past. It's usually backward looking, right? You get monarchies, right? Kings and castles and princesses and so forth. Rather crucially, you get magic. Yeah. And what is the problem with magic? The problem with magic is it is beyond our capacity to master. It is something that is unknown to us and inaccessible to all but a very select elite few. And so it's saying to the mass of ordinary people, you can never have control over your destiny because you're always at the mercy of the wizards, of the you know, I always think of Game of Thrones, the dragons are going to come and and all of a sudden, you know, they burn everyone up. Yeah. The mysterious kind of soothsayer. Or
in the Star Wars world, you're always at the mercy of the Force, either the dark side or the light side.
Exactly. Yeah. Which and so what is the Force? It's this inexplicable, although I think at some point Lucas does make an ill-advised attempt to explain it, but not in this movie. Inexplicable thing.
But he does explain it when he does, as in exactly the terms that you're already talking about. It's the exclusive property of a particular series of bloodlines.
Yes.
Right, and it is not inaccessible, which is, you know, in the one of the later movies, the Rian Johnson one, The Last Jedi. Right, that's why, you know, when it comes out, like the claim that actually anybody can put themselves in communion, right, with the Force, that it's such a controversial storyline for your Star Wars aficionados.
Yes, but that Rian Johnson kind of ordinary people's agency, and then the Donnie Yen character in Rogue One
yeah.
is where you would take this universe if you were a critical science
Yeah.
fiction scholar or author.
Uh-huh.
You would reject or downplay
Yeah.
the elements of fantasy and certainly the elements of magic,
Yeah.
because what you're left with, rather depressingly, I think we conclude in this third section, is a cyclical politics that can never go anywhere,
Yeah.
where the fates are determined by backwards-looking monarchies and magic, and the fact that those two things exist is they're not separate things, right? They're together
Yeah.
for a reason. They're inherent in that textual structure.
Yeah.
In conclusion, what, 2 thumbs up, Star Wars?
Yes, maybe.
Yep, two thumbs in some sort of position, one way or another. Definitely a hidden gem, though. Check it out.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it,
Yeah,
which you may not have, it is available.
Yeah.
You can stream it.
check it out. I think it's going to be a hit.
It might be.
Okay, so thank you for joining us, and
See you next time.
that's it.
Yes.